Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope everyone is having a wonderful summer. This is the next installment of our webinar series from the Institute for the Study of Business Markets. The Institute is proud to present Bringing Millennials to Meaning by Nell, Derick, Debevoise. Here's Nell. She's coming to us from Washington, D.C. today, even though she's based out of New York, and I'll let her tell you more about herself when she gets on. And I'm Lynn Nienyo, a director for the Institute. We're using a format that allows us to hear you hopefully well and also interact with us. So if you have a question at any time during this webinar, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a folder with a Q on it. Click on that and you'll be able to type in a question. I'll be monitoring those questions during the webinar, so I'll see your question as it comes in, and if it's appropriate, I'll share it with Nell at the time, or I'll save it till the end. But feel free to type your question at any time that you think of one. This particular webinar will be recorded, as we have with the others, and available to anyone that's signed up to attend for the next 30 days. You'll get a note after the webinar of how to retrieve that and also how to see the handouts. If you're a member of the Institute, you will have access to this webinar for all time in B2B Pulse. And if you need more information about how to connect into Pulse, please feel free to contact myself or Lori after the webinar. Just respond to the email that you get and you'll get some help with that. So who are we? The Institute is a nonprofit network of researchers and practitioners, and we're currently headquartered at Penn State, but we have offices around the United States, including Philadelphia and Chicago. If you're on our webinar, you are probably a B2B marketer, and that means that you also appreciate the fact that we are a small fraction of the resources that are spent on research in B2B marketing, but we're about 65% of the global economy. So we feel strongly that we bring value in being able to improve our capabilities in B2B marketing through our research. We have a tremendous quality and quantity of academics at within our group that are working on projects for us. Here's just a smattering. We've recently had Bob Cooper present as well in our webinar, and he's taught courses for us. And we have a wide range of practitioners. These are just a sampling of our member companies who participate with us. Coming up, we have the Big Talk, which will be held in State College at Penn State. I highly encourage you and your teams to consider attending in September. You'll have direct access to some amazing research and also each other, which is a wonderful time to share things that you are working on, as well as solutions you might have for others. Our authors forum is in August 24th, and you may want to participate in that. And then on the far right is our list of webinars that continues, and our next one will be in July on digital marketing with some real handy ideas on how you can improve your own capabilities in digital marketing and ROI particularly. So let me turn it over to Nell, and Nell, I'm going to hand this over to you. And I hope you'll enjoy this. Again, if you have questions, just feel free to type as you go, and I'll be back at the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Nell, Derick, Debevoise. I am the founder and CEO of Inspiring Capital. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we get going. But in the meantime, thank you, Lynn and Lori at ISBM for organizing this. The topics of millennials and specifically meaning and meaningful work are ones that are very near and dear to my heart. So I'm excited to share some of my and my organization's learnings with you all. So let's dive in. First thing, I'm just going to bring us shortly through the agenda of what we're looking to do. And so here's an overview. Just give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming to all of this from. hopefully do a little bit of myth busting. I think you all have probably noticed that there is a lot of talk and writing and thinking and commentary, maybe even some griping about millennials and millennials at work. And so we've found some really important research that's important to keep in mind. Second, we'll talk a little bit about the changing context that affects millennials, as well as all of us at work. Finally, pick apart a little bit meaning. What is this notion of, maybe you've heard meaning, purpose, social impact. There's a lot of buzzwords that are going around about this, which I think is great. It's important. It represents some real opportunities, but it can also get a little bit buzzwordy. So we'll hopefully clarify and demystify some of that. And then finally, really come away with what I hope will be some useful next steps for you all at the end of our hour together. My goal is always to really make things actionable and useful for you in your day-to-day work. So since Lynn gave us such a great orientation to Zoom and showed us those chat functions down at the bottom of the screen that you should be able to see, I would love to just hear a few things from you and what you're thinking about before we jump in. Will people just type in the chat box? So again, find the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and type a word or two that comes to mind when you hear the topic of millennials. Maybe it's positive, maybe it's negative, maybe it's a question or a statistic you've heard that you wonder about, but just type a little message, if you would, in the chat and let me know. Yep, entitled, right out there. That comes up a lot. So glad that we got that out first. What else do people think about or feel when they hear about millennials or when you engage with them at work? Don't be shy. This is a safe space and will not be part of the recording that is made public. So don't hesitate to share concerns or thoughts. I know people are probably finding their chat box, but digital natives, yep, that's a super important one. Thank you, Suzanne. I think that definitely affects their reality. All right, and then I'll just give you another 20 seconds before we move on, but if you do have specific questions or points that you would like to get out of this time together, please do let me know, because there is far more to say than could possibly be covered in this time, and so I'm quite happy to try to customize if you have specific questions. Oh, I see. Maybe chat is not enabled.
Right, so chat will be for panelists mostly. So
Ah.
you can ask people to put it in the Q&A box.
Got it. Sorry about that. All right, so my bad, technical problem. So much for my digital nativism. But if people have questions or thoughts, type them into Lynn and she will share with me. But in the meantime, then let's move along in the slides, and I'll just give you a little bit of background. So I am, depending on your definition, sort of a borderline millennial. I was born in 1980. The most commonly used definition of millennials is folks who were born between 1982 and 2000. So this is kind of college through young working age, 34 or so year old working people, which one important thing to note there is that that's a very broad category, right? Those are a 23-year-old employee at your firm or colleague is a very different human to interact with than a 33-year-old, for example, who has 10 years of experience. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the millennial categorization is often a little bit too broad to be totally clarifying or useful. So I am a borderline millennial. I have studied leadership development and adult learning at places like Harvard, Cambridge, Columbia Business School, London Business School over the last 15 years, and have also been working in the professional development and leader development space globally. So I think a lot about this. I work a lot with millennials as well as more senior folks. And the company that I started 4 years ago, Inspiring Capital, works to help individuals as well as organizations to understand what they're good at, what they love, and what they need so that they can find that meaningful work. Because, as we'll see in a little bit, that is where we are each most productive as individuals, but also as organizations. And so I hope that is some reason that you are here with us today, is to understand how to unlock the increase in productivity and eventually revenue growth, as well as satisfaction that can be found in doing meaningful work. So at Inspiring Capital, we have had over 150 people come through over 10,000 hours of training with us. We've supported over 40 organizations, including Red Cross, employees at American Express and KKR, but also small startups as well. And so very, very open to helping you all think about the various challenges that you're dealing with as you do that. Contact information is throughout the slides. So with that intro and background, let us get started. The first thing, as I said, that I really want to do is to talk about some myth busting, and really break down a little bit of what we hear and think about millennials. I'll start maybe with the entitled comment, which I don't think is necessarily a myth. It's certainly a very common perception that millennials are entitled, and I think can be true. We were in the Research Triangle Park down in North Carolina doing an event with a lot of large employers there about millennials and how to best employ them. And we came up with a question of whether, are millennials entitled or empowered? And I think that it can go both ways. I think the positive thing is that millennials really speak up for what they want. They will ask managers for stretch assignments or for promotions or raises. And in some ways, as a manager, that's helpful, right? To know where someone wants to go is helpful to retain them and give them the stretch goals they need to get there. On the other hand, it can also feel entitled. You just got here 6 months ago. Of course, it's not time for a promotion, for example. And so we'll talk a little more how to parse that if you're finding that with your employees or on your teams. But the two primary myths that I really wanted to discuss, the first is some research out of UNC. And so you'll see this number on the left. They surveyed 5,400 professionals who are from the Millennial, Gen X, and Boomer generation. And they asked them a variety of questions about what these people want out of work. And actually, the shocking thing is that the desire and the goals that people had for their professional relationships and their career were actually incredibly aligned. Regardless of generation, people were saying a lot of the same things. These are not surprising things, but folks said they want to work on challenging projects. They want to be compensated at a competitive level for their age and training. They want to have opportunities for advancement and chances to learn and grow in their jobs. They want to be respected and fairly treated. And finally, work-life balance came up for millennials as well as boomers and Xers, right? This elusive idea of balancing a very busy, ambitious professional life with a personal one is something that is pretty universal among people. And so we'll talk on the next slide a little more about why millennials are coming at it, perhaps with a bit more entitlement or conviction. But a lot of these things are not different from millennials. They're just being expressed perhaps in a different way. And the second important myth here, which is the colorful chart on the right, comes out of the Deloitte Millennial Survey, for which there's a link at the bottom of the slide if you're interested to dig further. There's a lot of great information in that study. And this one that I pulled out is speaking to millennials' intention to remain at a certain company. And so what you can see here is that actually far more millennials and an increasing number of millennials are now planning to stay at their current company beyond 5 years, right? Whereas many fewer of them are thinking to leave within 2 years. And so this is a really important trend, even just in the last year between Deloitte's 2016 and 2017 studies. But I think it's a really important thing to remember that actually almost as many of your millennial employees are really hoping for a 5+ year trajectory at your company. There are still a few more of them planning to leave within 2 years, but the gap is narrowing and the trend is toward that longer time stability. So I think that that represents an exciting opportunity for employers to really engage and retain these young employees. Again, feel free to jump in with questions along the way. But in the meantime, let's move along to some of the background that we're seeing. What we notice and what we have seen in those 10,000 hours of training is that the context of work is changing. This is not going to be a newsflash for any of you, but I think it's really important to remember the extent to which our workplace has changed. So the primary drivers that are at work here. First, of course, is technology, right? The changes in technology are huge in terms of how this affects our work life, but also our personal lives, and then how we interact with the two. A headline with all the millennial professionals and millennial managers we talk to is, of course, social media, right? And that transparency, that peer comparison that social media creates, which leads to a real deep sense of anxiety. I think there's a real competitiveness and anxiety among young millennials, especially that they are not Mark Zuckerberg. They are not the 13-year-old blogger who's making $200,000 a month, or the slime producer that I just saw this morning, who is, I believe, 14 years old and making $200,000 a month in corporate sponsorships for her slime videos on YouTube, right? So this is a profoundly different environment than the one that most of us grew up in. And there are some upsides, there's some great opportunity of information sharing and brand building on social media. But there's a real anxiety that this creates for millennials and for the rest of us, probably, if we're engaged in these media. But what the millennials that we work with say is that they may look polished and comfortable with technology and ambitious in their careers, but in many cases, they have a deep anxiety that they're not good enough, that they're not on the right path or moving fast enough. So I think that's a really important influence of technology. The second piece about technology goes back to the perception of millennials being entitled, which is that they have grown up with anything immediately available. Right, particularly if you live in a big urban area, you can get your phone and dream up a meal or a purchase or an article you'd like to read, and you have it within 3 clicks and from 30 seconds to 3 days max. Right, and so that immediate gratification that has been enabled by technology is a really important difference to understand these folks have grown up with. And so we see frequently, and I imagine some of you are seeing, the sense that that these millennial professionals may come with that same immediate gratification in their career path and their career expectations, right? They want the raise now. They want the stretch project this month. They want a promotion every 8 months. And that's just not generally the pace of work. And so we have to figure out where to meet in the middle so that they don't get frustrated and disengaged, but also that they have realistic expectations about how they will move through the workplace. The second theme here is economics. There's a lot to say about the economic conditions of our time. I think the two that matter most in this case that we really think about is the student loan burden that millennials are now living with, right? College costs and tuition have increased far beyond the pace of inflation and wages. And so, the average of $20,000 of student loans is quite low for many of the more urban areas with higher costs of living and the more professional, elite folks that some of you may be managing in your companies. And so that is a real influence on millennials' decisions and perspectives on their career. They have this hard and fast commitment to repay a significant student loan. The second piece within the economics trend or context is the fact that, economic growth is slowing in much of the developed world. And what that means is that many of these young people are not necessarily going to be better off than their parents, right? And that's the first time that that's happened in the United States in recent history, right? We have been on a continuous path toward growth, increasing wages, increasing quality of life. And millennials today are seeing and hearing and feeling that they actually may not just simply, as a matter of fact, progress toward a better quality of living. And make no mistake that influences, again, that sense of anxiety, but also the striving or the creativity maybe and non-traditional approach they're taking to careers. So finally, coming back to our context, I want to speak briefly about this rapid change that we're seeing. I went to a great lecture the other day, and the speaker reminded us that today is the slowest pace of change that you will know in your lifetime. Right? So take that in for a minute. If today feels like, wow, Monday, gosh, things really are different and moving so fast, it will be even faster and more different tomorrow, right? We are just on this accelerating curve of change in the way our economy works, the way that our companies have to work, the way that each of our roles and functions work within that. And so, again, back to just like millennials are digital natives, they are change natives, right? They grew up in this highly changeable environment. And so it doesn't shake them in the same way that it might those of us who are used to a more gradual, slow evolution in our companies and our work. So these are three highlights that I do think are very important, because what's important to say is that they affect all of us, right? None of us is immune to this. None of us is able to do our jobs without technology these days. What is different is the fact that the millennials have grown up with it. Again, they're native to this context. It's the only thing they've known. And so they have different coping strategies. They don't realize that they have to have coping strategies. It's just the way they are. Whereas the rest of us are sort of scrambling to catch up, maybe hanging on to some of the old ways in some cases, or just having to do that behavior and brain change that it requires to adapt. And so I think that a lot of the challenges and friction that we see between millennials and their organizations or their managers can be traced back to some of this changing context, which actually has nothing to do with the millennials themselves, but just a changing workplace. So an important background, I think the final point to make here is that what it means is that by appreciating these millennial traits, and understanding how they like to work and accommodating that, they are actually representing changes that all professionals, all humans that we work with would benefit from, right? Some of those, going back to the UNC research, that we all want to be challenged in our career. We all strive for that work-life balance. So some of these initiatives that your firms are thinking about to help engage millennials are actually going to have some great effect if built out properly for everyone across your firm. And so feel good about the scalability and universality of that. All right, we're going to move on to meaning, our topic of the day. And so first, hopefully this slide gives you a chuckle about sort of the caricature of meaning that you might picture or have in your mind. So in our case, we think about meaning in three realms. And I think it's useful to break it down in that way. So the first thing is that what is the meaning, if you will, of the millennials' own role, right? Exactly in what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. How does that have significance for the company or for the community? But why does it matter that they complete whatever their deliverables are in a given day? The second layer is the company, right? So not just their role or your team, but the entire company that they and you work for, right? What is the meaning of that company's existence in the world? Are you providing, pharmaceuticals that end disease and help with sanitation around the world, right? Hugely meaningful. Or perhaps you are offering technology or hardware components that power the technology of all of our economy today. Again, monstrous meaning, right? And so it's not necessarily the sort of idealistic, save the world, teach a child to read sense of meaning that people are usually going for. It can be a much broader sense of meaning in the context of the larger economy. So the first level is the work they're doing. The second level, of course, is that company purpose. And then the third one that's important also and valuable to engage with is what about the world? What good are we doing for society around us or for the environment? How are we hopefully not doing harm and possibly even contributing some positive impact? Again, maybe it's from pharmaceuticals and health benefits or technology or financial innovation. There's a lot of ways that this can be true without being a charitable nonprofit teaching children to read. So that's how we like to really demystify this sense of meaning and purpose. Because, as we'll see in just a second, it's actually really powerful for your company to harness this sense of meaning. This is some research by Bain that was published in HBR. The link is there for you at the bottom of the page. And so it's powerful, I think, to see this. I myself, even with my work in this area, was quite impressed when I saw these statistics. So what you can see here that's important is a satisfied employee is the baseline, right? And so if you have folks who are satisfied, which unfortunately Gallup research shows us is the minority of the workplace, it is less than 50%, but let's use them as the baseline. They are 100% productive. If you're able to engage someone and they're, sort of bought into what's happening and like their team, maybe there are some, extracurriculars related to work, they get a bit more productive, right? Which is great. They don't have almost 50% more productivity than those satisfied folks. But finally, this top bar, right? If you're able to inspire employees with this sense of meaning of their work or the company or what you're doing in the community, they're more than twice as productive as a satisfied employee. Right? Just think about that for a minute. If you were able to essentially double the productivity and output of the folks on your team, that would be a game changer. Right? And so I think it's really important to understand that in the 21st century economy, where we are all, honestly, really battling for talent, it's important to be able to recognize the power of this notion of inspiration and meaning and a higher purpose to really unlock the potential of your team. It's just, there's no question that it is going to be the game changer between companies that sort of fizzle or fade versus those who really rise to the challenge and take over the new talent pool of millennials, but also the new consumer pool, which is also, of course, largely millennial. Apart from this engagement, there's a lot of great research that shows that connecting people's work to a sense of purpose helps them be more innovative and creative, right? What team doesn't need some better creative problem solving these days? And so if there is that larger purpose, people tend to be more likely to find creative solutions. Finally, of course, there's a lot of research around the brand value of companies that are able to link themselves to a larger sense of meaning. And the best way to do this is starting with your employees, your millennials, very likely. All right, so where do we find the sense of meaning? These are back to our 3 concentric circles. And so the first place is, things in their role. Is there a way that they can be innovative and perhaps think more about the environmental sustainability of their core work and product? That would be a great impact for the company, but also really give that millennial employee a very specific sense of a larger meaning beyond simply getting the work done. Another great way in roles, if you or others have hiring or recruitment responsibility or interviewing, you can really take an active role in building the diversity and the inclusion that you're able to foster in your role and in your team, right? That's a really great larger sense of meaning to tie into whatever work you're doing, whether it's marketing, social media, branding, any of those sub-functions that you or your millennial employees might be doing. When you can build in that diversity piece around the firm, that really can be that larger sense of meaning. Second, maybe there isn't an obvious way in their specific role, but maybe there are opportunities around the firm, right? Many companies now have a green team or a sustainability ERG, employee resource group, right? If there's not one, maybe you can talk to HR about starting something. But there are often ways around the company where millennials can really plug into some of this meaningful work about why the company matters, why the company's work in the society or for the environment matters. And finally, we're very pragmatic, and we recognize that in some cases there's just work that has to be done, right? It's not necessarily, it's a long pipeline to get to that social or environmental benefit. It's got to be done, and that is this person's role. But you want that 225% increase in their productivity, right? So you want to help them find meaning. And so here what we recommend is there really are myriad opportunities in the community, and so many companies have done so much that employees just often don't know about yet to help them find this meaning, right? So maybe it's a volunteer day. Maybe it's, matching donations for the charitable donations that people are making, right? Maybe it's even paid time to go volunteer with things they're interested in independently. So all of these various things that are generally controlled by the CSR team or a foundation if you have one, or HR itself, these are really powerful tools that are often underutilized that could help your millennial folks feel like the company is really supporting their quest to find this meaningful work related to their job with you. And so it is never going to be, as long as they're working in corporate, of course, there is a profit motive and work that needs to be done. But the important thing is to help them find these broader notions of meaning, why their work matters to you, why it matters to the team and the company, and then in the broadest sense to society around you. So I want to move to some specific next steps and tactics that we have seen to work and be productive for people. Perhaps some quick wins. The first one is really just a matter of empathy. I can imagine that in a place of frustration, which I have absolutely felt myself as an employer of many millennials, it can be difficult to turn first to empathy. But I can promise that as the more seasoned, mature, and patient professionals, it really can be powerful simply to empathize, right? Go back to that sense that I mentioned of anxiety, right? This constant comparison with their peers, with the superstars of their generation, and all of the anxiety that creates, and understand that that's grating at them. The second piece here is all of the uncertainty that I talked about that we're all living. What that means is that they don't necessarily have as clear of a career path, right? It's not quite the straightforward vertical path up to retirement at 65 with a pension and a retirement that they know will be safe and secure. And so this lack of clarity can be also anxiety producing, and can be really helped by you saying, hey, how are you feeling about your next stage at the company? Where would you like to be in 6 months? What about in 5 years? And really just sharing, recognizing that you understand that it can be difficult to navigate today, and that you're willing to be a resource and to help them with that. The other piece of financial uncertainty that I mentioned about student loans, as well as broader economic uncertainty and slower growth, again, that's something to empathize with. Understand that we're all in that together, but they're earlier in their career, and certainly have this huge student loan debt, and so that is probably influencing some of their behavior. Finally, understand that immediate gratification generation that they have grown up with, right? It's not their fault. It is true, but it isn't their fault that they have been able to enjoy this immediate gratification of anything, anytime, anywhere. And so that is not how work works. And so it is important to understand that's where they're coming from, and then work with them to push back and set some limits and help them get educated about the time and pace and system of the workplace, where you don't just get everything that you want at one click. There's a process, and you do have to really earn and make your case to get those things. So that's the empathy piece that I think is really important, at least on days when you feel like you have the patience and the energy to start there. The second piece of this is ask. Ask folks, ask your employees, ask your millennial colleagues, what do they care about? What meaning would they like to see in the world? How do they understand the larger meaning of the company? How do they understand your team's function in that larger firm? How do they understand their own role in your team? Right? Again, I think it's easy to see millennial employees as highly proficient, highly confident, right? They have this digital native swagger, I would say, which makes them look and feel extremely competent and fast moving and confident. But in fact, I think it's really important to remember that they're young. They're young professionals. They don't know necessarily how their role fits into your team, right? They don't necessarily know why your team is critical for your company's success. And they certainly may not understand how your company or firm fits in the larger economic sense. Right. And so ask them where they're at on these questions, and you may reveal some really important understanding that you can help them understand and wrap their head around, to connect the dots of why what they do does have meaning. Of course, also interesting to start a non-work conversation. What are the causes they care about? Are they involved with nonprofits, right? To get at some of that more traditional charitable sense of purpose or meaning beyond your company's purpose. And finally, explain, right? Once you hear some of their questions or some of their positions, tell them how their work matters, right? When you're asking for a deliverable, or you're asking to rush something, take the extra 90 seconds to say, hey, I know that this puts a bit of a crunch on you, but our client has a meeting with a competitor on Friday, and so we need to be sure to get it to them on Thursday so that we're best positioned. right? And so I really need this from you Wednesday so I can integrate it into my piece, because I'm really under a crunch for this. Right. But I think often just that simple background can be really helpful. And I know for me, it's difficult to remember to do that and to take the time to do that. Right. I'm very busy myself, of course, as we all are. And so it can be frustrating to add the step. But I have really seen the concrete payoff and the way that they understand, they respond to that understanding, which I would have assumed they knew, right? It seems to me that it should be obvious. If I'm asking for it now, there's a good reason. But indeed, in many cases, they don't have that larger perspective because they're younger in their career. Another thing that I find works is to explain, if you have a high level meeting with your peers or maybe with your boss, share back some information with your direct reports, right? With your younger people. Help them feel like they're staying involved in the higher levels of strategy and planning, right? Because of course they don't have those strategic responsibilities early in their career, but if you don't give them some window into it, it's difficult for them to grow that strategic vision. And so the more you can provide little tidbits is really helpful. And finally, back to this outside of the workplace opportunity for meaning, help them understand the benefits that your company has for any of those volunteer things, right? Again, these tend to be very underutilized resources. I imagine that you may not even know what there is in terms of donation matching or volunteer paid time off, because it just often doesn't get dispersed well around the firm. And so, ask some questions, go to HR or the CSR team and see what they're doing here and how you might be able to make some of those benefits available to your millennial employees who have some of these aspirations to get involved with outside causes. So these are some ideas for some quick wins. I think that, starting in that empathic place is a really important first step. And then just asking questions, and that will lead you to the things that you can start to help explain and help your millennial colleagues understand. One of our favorite refrains is that perfect is the enemy of the good. And so, I think it can be really intimidating to think about, how are we going to engage millennials for my department, right? How can I find meaning for the several hundred or tens of thousands of millennials if you're at one of the larger multinationals? How can we possibly provide meaning for tens of thousands of people? We have a job to do, right? But I think that if just you as managers and your colleagues as managers can come from this empathic orientation, understand that that these folks are not necessarily genetically different from us or even behaviorally different, but they just grew up in a different context, right? And so they are born into the challenging work environment that we are all trying to cope with. And so they deal with it in different ways. But there really are some mutual benefits to hearing their perspectives and accommodating those in the workplace, even because they are more broad human trends today. So with that, I will leave you with this slide, which has some of my contact information, and love for questions to come in if there are any. I am more than happy. We do events and workshops, and I also speak at companies, at network events, at alumni groups, at conferences. And so please let me know if there are questions or specific topics that you would like to dive more deeply into. Or if you're just looking to set up a quick 15-minute phone call, I'm more than happy to bounce ideas and provide further specifics based on what you're thinking about.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Nell. That was very, very interesting. Now I'm questioning a lot of things that I've been thinking. And I will remind the group here that please feel free to start typing your questions. We have one that we'll give you and let you chew on. And I'll remind you again, too, that all of the slides and the presentation is available after the session. You'll get an email from Lori that will give you that information about how to get it. So here's an interesting question. I find this one, I didn't want to distract you from what you were going through because I think this one might be a little bit deep too. So
Sure.
the millennial classification is between anyone from 1982 on, but you think about 1982 as kind of pre-internet, and like a year 2000, a millennial from that was born in 2000 or 1998 being exposed to much different time growing up. How does that differ in millennials, if at all? The
Yeah.
internet, post-internet kind of timing.
Absolutely. So that's exactly, that initial point that this millennial classification is at times problematically broad, right? Because even leaving aside the technology piece, right, a 23-year-old new hire out of university is wildly different than a 32-year-old who has been around for 10 years and worked their way through the organization or several organizations. And so I think that's 100% right. Specifically to the point of technology, so 1982 is when they were born, which means that by the time they were in college, they were handing in assignments by email. That was kind of, I know at my college and certainly many others, those freshmen were the ones who were issued email addresses by default when they enrolled, right? And so that is, it's not quite the same, of course, as what we're doing today with Siri and our iPhones and all the rest. But still, in terms of especially professional technology of email and cell phones and texting, by the time they started kind of their adult life in college, that was all on board. So, just a nuance on the technology side. But I think, in terms of how to use that information in the workplace, it is incredibly important to differentiate your new hires, your 0 to 3 years versus 3 to 5, and then 5 to 10, and getting more on in the workplace and in their career trajectories, in terms of expectations, in terms of what they need to know. I think there's a great place for some pretty basic technology training for new hires right out of college who are 0 to 3 years in, to differentiate what is an acceptable message to send by text to a colleague, if anything, right? And what is the expectation there versus what should be done by email versus what should be done by phone or ideally in person. But I think that it is a fair thing to teach 22 to 25-year-olds how to do that correctly when they come into the workplace, rather than assume that they know. I certainly see a lot of really problematic choices when it comes to what channel of communication to use. Whereas, I think if you put that topic in a millennial training where you had 27 to 32-year-olds, they would very likely be quite offended. And I think rightly so. If they've gotten that far along in your organization, they're probably doing a reasonably good job differentiating those channels. So that's, I think it does come down to that, to understanding that the millennial lumping is at times problematic, and you really do need to think about it more specifically as different career stages.
Great. There's another question we have. So now we also have the opportunity to manage people remotely. And so now millennials are coming into the workplace that may not be a workplace. What does one successfully manage a millennial that is working remotely? We clearly don't want to micromanage, but we need to make sure we understand what they're working on and also how they're working on it. And to your point, even how they're communicating about it. Advice?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a great one, because I think remote work suits millennials well in a lot of ways because they love that flexibility, that autonomy and independence. But it's highly problematic, most specifically, I think, because of their collaborative nature, right? They tend to be very social and keen for that kind of company. And so it can be challenging if they end up feeling really isolated. To end on the good news, they are very comfortable with digital communication, and so often can get that feeling of connectedness and collaboration through remote channels, right? So all in all, a good opportunity if done well. So how do you do it well? I think the first piece is, again, really explicit expectations and guidelines. It's dangerous because they're natives to assume that they know how technology works for you as a manager and for your team and company, right? Which is not true. They're very savvy with technology for their own uses, but not necessarily for ours as a company. And so again, that explicit communication, when do you send a text? When do you email? When should you really be picking up the phone and getting on a call? When should you be scheduling a call because it's going to take more of my time and I need to know it's coming? Really setting out those guidelines. When they're onboarding, and ideally having those available, right? Maybe it's an internal manual or a Google Doc as reference, where they can go back and remember how and where to communicate what types of issues. I think the second piece is to, as much as you can, there are some interesting technology tools now that really track people's activity and work. So, without feeling like Big Brother, if there are systems that they can be on where you're able to kind of follow activity, that's a good thing. The danger there is to expect regularity. I think that if it doesn't matter when the work is getting done, just that it's getting done, then let them, know that they may be working between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., cranking out some great stuff and then not starting until 10 in the next morning. So I think that if you can have that kind of passive oversight, it's useful. And finally, build the relationship. Millennials are very, generally speaking, social creatures. They want that personal relationship as well as the managerial one. And it can be easy when you don't have the literal water cooler to kind of chat around. It can be easy to lose that personal nature. And so whether it's a standing call or, a Friday afternoon, quick chat volley maybe, or email about their weekend or their summer plans. I think that making sure you have that personal connection is super important to keep the relationship warm in the way that they want it.
Great. We have another one. So, would you think about the Gen Z? So we hear the next generation past millennial coming in. Can you comment about that, when that steps in and what that looks like to you? And is that something we should also be considering?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as soon as I feel like we've started wrapping our heads around these guys, that Gen Z is right behind them, headed to college now. And so they will be our interns and, our employees soon enough. Of course, I think it's too early to tell because they are not yet working yet. And so we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I think that a lot of generational trends can be explained looking at their parents, and so these are these are children of Xers, and the oldest millennials at some point will also be parents to Gen Z. So a very technologically savvy household, right? Not only are these folks total digital natives from birth, but their parents are relatively, if not completely, technologically savvy as well. And so I think that that's certainly important. I think that there will be fewer, we will have a lot of this friction rubbed out. It won't be quite the same gap of technological change from the boomers to the millennials versus the Xers to the Gen Z. And so I do think that will help. And I think that the Gen Z has grown up. They've not had the same kind of ruptures in their time. The millennials have seen 2001, September 11th. They've seen two, .com crashes, a general recession for the last years as they've been coming up in the workplace as young professionals. And I think that we'll see what these next 10 years bring. But I do think we're in a stage of a bit more slow, but sort of steady economic conditions. And so I can imagine that these Gen Zs will be a little bit more stable, less anxious, and less kind of striving, a little bit more maybe a little bit more patient than some of that anxiety and pace that we see in the millennials. So those are some of the commentaries that I've heard at this very early stage. But again, they're just kind of 17, 18 coming into college age. So it's a little bit hard to know how they'll play out in the workplace.
Great, thank you. Okay, are there any more questions that we can answer? Great, I appreciate that. And of course, Nell is generously offered, and you continue to see her contact information if you want to go direct. And I hope you'll avail yourself of the webinar if you want to share it with friends. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much, Nell. I really appreciate that on behalf of the Institute. I think that was very, very helpful for us. Those of us that are far, far, far from that. And everyone have a great summer. We will have another webinar in July, and I hope you'll join us for that one. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Thanks, participants, for being here.